On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby, and Dan Flynn is Deputy Director of the ACL. Dan's back with us. In fact, just back from a visit to the United States. Dan, a special welcome back to 2020.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. It's a pleasure to be back. And, as you say, fresh from the March for Life on 20 January in Washington.
In Washington, D.C., it's the place where, so many of us will have in our mind the Washington Monument, and there are all sorts of things that have happened historically in that particular plaza area there in Washington, D.C. You were at that pro-life rally. It's called the March for Life. Set the scene for us, Dan. What was, just as you're there attending and you're observing, you're seeing the speakers, you're seeing the crowds, give us a bit of an idea what it looked like.
Neil, it was an incredibly large march. It was, I would have thought, probably the order of 150,000 people. The Washington Post, who are no, friends of the pro-life movement, have said that it was larger than last year's march. I think what people would see and what we saw were they were predominantly young people, and so I would say, sort of 60% of the people were, certainly under 30. With a very high, high number of college students, university-age students, 18 to 25. So, these young people, I think, Neil, are more pro-life than their parents are. And, we heard stories of many buses travelling in from colleges. They'd drive 32 hours, bringing 5 buses from a Christian university. That was commonplace. So it was a terrific event, Neil, very energised by the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And I know your listeners, you've kept them informed that in June of last year, a case of Dodd's overturned Roe versus Wade, which had basically sort of kept a clamp on abortion law in the US, stating that it was a constitutional right. So that was the decision in 1973. And the Dodd's decision last year said, look, we look at the Constitution and actually there is no constitutional right to abortion. So that was a major breakthrough on the 24th of June last year. There were people walking around wearing T-shirts that said the 24th of June, 2022. So there was a great enthusiasm, Neil, for the repeal of Roe versus Wade and for the states being able to determine what would be, agreed protections for the unborn.
Dan, 150,000 marchers at the March for Life in the US. How do you describe the mood of the people? Because, sometimes you have rallies and, I think our rallies in Australia, pro-life rallies, are usually fairly peaceful. Was it a peaceful march where was there a sort of a militancy in the crowd? How do you describe the mood of those who were there for the march?
No, I don't think there was any militancy. I think there was a lot of, probably a sense of prayerfulness, to be honest. A lot of very devout people there. A lot of leadership provided by the Catholic Church. Jonathan Rumi was the principal guest speaker, and so there was just a very strong sense of unity there, probably led by the Catholics. Reverend Franklin Graham also participated. So it was across the denominations, but. Very prayerful, I would say, and very energised. So, of course, this was the first march since the repeal of Roe versus Wade. So, I suppose in a post-Roe world, it could be said, okay, well, the pro-life movement has achieved their purpose. Their goal in life was to repeal Roe versus Wade, and they organised immediately after that initial decision was decided. So, a great chance for celebration, and there was some of that. But the overriding message was, we're not done yet, that we have to make abortion not only illegal, but unthinkable.
Dan, if we were contrasting our own abortion laws in Australia with those abortion laws in the US, because as you described, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it took it out of the federal jurisdiction overall for all of the United States and put that responsibility back into the hands of the states. And remember, we were saying at the time, that's sort of the way that it has been in Australia, but there's some moves that are on right now that are trying to federalise some ways of looking at abortion here in Australia. If you're making a comparison between the two, how are things looking?
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it all. I think the truth is it has gone back to the states for regulation, and they are regulating in the US. We'll talk about there first. So in Texas, for example, there's a heartbeat law. And, once a heartbeat is detected, abortion is illegal. So in the last few months, the abortion rate has dropped dramatically, different estimates between 60 and 90%. So the states are making helpful protections, but there is still a strong argument that the federal Congress has work to do because there's an argument based on the 14th Amendment that they should protect life, and where a state fails to provide protection, the Commonwealth or the federal in the US should protect. So, we see in Australia the states legislate in relation to abortion. They do it pretty badly, to be honest, Neil, because most of the states are abortion on demand. You see a scenario where, say, in Victoria, abortion up to 24 weeks for no reason, and abortion post 24 weeks for any reason. So it's, abortion on demand is the norm in Australia. And to pick up your point, federal politicians have with Roe versus Wade being overturned in the US, Australian abortion rights are under threat. Let's do something. Let's protect abortion from a federal level. And there is currently an inquiry on to achieve just that. So Roe versus Wade has had the impact, I think, in Australia of creating on the left side of politics a movement to make sure that abortion is never limited, whereas in the US it has immediately made abortion more limited, because a lot of laws, like the Texas law, were in place, but they were ineffective or couldn't operate because of Roe versus Wade. As soon as Roe versus Wade is lifted, all of these state restrictions are now in force. And culturally, I think we're very different approach to abortion, Neil. In the US, I think there's a lot of people are very uncomfortable with abortion at the later stages, and that's why the states have, 15-week, 20-week heartbeat, all sorts of graduations on the scale. Whereas in Australia, the left have led the discussion on this, and the view of the Labor Party essentially is abortion on demand should never be interfered with. And that is a dominant narrative, but it's not so dominant in the US. The other point I'd make, Neil, is that Republican legislators, senators and congressmen are very pro-life, pass pro-life legislation. We'll all remember the fuss before Kevin McCarthy became Speaker, how hard it was to select one, and he was eventually selected on the 7th of January. Well, the very first pieces of legislation were pro-life legislation in the Congress. One was a Babies Born Alive bill, very similar to the George Christensen Australian model. And another one was to call on President Biden to condemn attacks on pro-life centres and churches, and there were Molotov cocktails and burnings of, pro-life advocacy groups. But the Biden administration looked the other way. So the first two bills in the Congress related to pro-life issues, and that's because to be pro-life is quite mainstream in the Republican Party, and sadly that's not mainstream in the Liberal Party. And, you contrast with, say, Bernie Finn, a pro-life lawmaker in Victoria, when he, utters a pro-life sentiment, then he's kicked out of the party because it's off message. So the Liberal Party here is very shy on pro-life issues. The Liberal Party members of Parliament who are pro-life are basically muted for fear of reprisal from the Liberal Party. So fortunately for the US, being pro-life is a very mainstream Republican position.
Well, as a Christian, Dan, we might hope, we might pray that a pro-life position becomes mainstream. And I picked up a quote from that March for Life that you attended, and from the Congressional Pro-Life Caucus, a guy named Chris Smith, who said, "Future generations will someday look back on us and wonder how and why a society that bragged about its commitment to human rights could have legally sanctioned and aggressively promoted," now I apologise to some listeners here, aggressively promoted child beheadings, dismemberment, chemical poisoning, and forced expulsion from the womb. And as uncomfortable it is to hear words like that, this is the reality of abortion. So being mainstream pro-life, and as you say, there are those proponents of, say, Born Alive Bill and those who are pro-life in some sections in our political system. These things ought to be mainstream, Dan. And I know that there's a march coming up in South Australia. Martin Iles is going to be a guest speaker there. It's coming up on the 11th of February. It's called the Walk for Life in Adelaide. Any thoughts here about, Adelaide listeners getting involved in that one?
Well, absolutely. And, the most important piece of advocacy that any South Australian person can do in that week is to actually go to that march, to get the pram out, get the children out, go to the march, listen to the speeches, participate, because the presence of numbers communicates so much to members of Parliament. And they will see these numbers, they'll reflect deeply, and there is no doubt that the success of the US, the repeal of Roe versus Wade, was so much as a result of the large numbers. It's interesting you mentioned Congressman Mike Smith, who, in reference to his speech at the March for Life. I was fortunate to meet him at a small reception afterwards, and he is from Pennsylvania, and he is seeking to bring a heartbeat law into the federal Congress, so to make a national minimum standard that where there's a heartbeat there can be no abortion, because in say a number of states there are no protections for the unborn. So he's saying that referencing the very detailed and kind of graphic words you used, when a heartbeat is detected, these abortions should stop. But while that bill may actually pass the Congress, because the Republicans control it, it won't become law because the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, led by Chuck Schumer, and President Joe Biden is not going to sign any pro-life legislation into law. So some of these bills are messaging bills, and the pro-life movement looks forward to the next elections in 2 years' time. But yes, by all means, South Australians, do everything you can to get to this march. And if you come from, Western Victoria, Hamilton, Horsham, cross the border and head over there and join that march.
It's a reminder, isn't it, that change doesn't happen in an instant or on a whim. There's a lot of hard work that goes into change. And if you had a good goal like that, a heartbeat law as a national standard, that could be a great place to start. And so for listeners who are interested, and especially Adelaide listeners, and as you say, Dan, there's people who are close to Adelaide that might be within a day's drive, might like to be there as a part of the Adelaide Walk for Life. As you say, Martin Iles is going to be one of the speakers there. They had 3,000 who marched last year. Here's how you can get some details. loveadelaide.org.au. That's the coordinating website, loveadelaide.org.au for Adelaide's Walk for Life. Hey, running out of time now, but some other things that are going on, especially the New South Wales State Election. The date closing in on us fairly quickly, 25th of March. Does the ACL have some special initiatives that we ought to be looking out for?
Well, absolutely. The Liberal, Labor, both parties, I suppose, offer certain promises and disappoint in different ways. I think where we as the ACL feel that a big difference can be made is in the upper house. And we look to, the possibility that perhaps somebody like a Lyle Shelton could be elected to the upper house. And he's not the only one in that sort of independent category. If the upper house can be a firewall to bad legislation, that would be great. Yes, Dominic Perrottet is doing a good job at a certain level, but under the Liberal government, there have been some very bad laws that have passed. Abortion and euthanasia have both passed under a Liberal government in New South Wales. So, that's something that's discouraging in many respects. And so, if it remains Liberal, we'll probably see more of that. We'll probably have to deal with conversion therapy type legislation. We'll probably go through under a Liberal government unless there is the preservative effect of a good upper house. So we also note that Mark Latham will be running in One Nation. He's brilliant on conversion therapy, on the sort of sensible notions of gender and protecting children in schools from gender fluid teaching. Mark Latham is resigning his seat and replacing himself with somebody else. And I think that may have already happened, so that he can now run and be an additional One Nation candidate. So people like Lyle Shelton, Mark Latham, we're looking for others, but we think the principal issue in this election is the firewalling in the upper house.
Isn't it amazing when you look at the context of what's happening, and as you're describing those movements and who will stand up and be a voice for what many say is common sense, we'll call them Christian values, but you've got Fred Nile, whose career in the New South Wales upper house is coming to an end, and as you say, there are independents who are backed by parties, but parties that don't have a specific, they're not registered with the Australian Electoral Commission for the election that's coming up. So that's why there's some of those candidates who are going to be independents. So we're likely to be talking a fair bit about independence in the lead up to the New South Wales state election, because with the void that's going to be left there in the upper house, it's almost crucial, isn't it, to have some Christian insight that comes into that upper house in New South Wales. It's going to be an important one, Dan.
Absolutely. And we've seen from Mark Latham, who doesn't profess to be a Christian, perhaps some of the best defence of Christianity there. I understand that Lyle Shelton, he's the leader of Family First nationally, but they couldn't be registered in time in New South Wales, so that's why he'll run as an independent. These are, I think, the spots to watch. If you 4 or 5 good, solid, pro-life Christian people could be in the upper house, I think that'll provide some good governance, if you like, and some good restraint on either a re-elected Liberal government or a Labor government.
Well, Dan Flynn, time has run out. Always good getting your insights. Thanks so much for that, and glad you returned home to us safely. It's a big year ahead, and excited about the initiatives of the Australian Christian Lobby. It'll be important, and with that New South Wales state election that's coming up, there'll be a special website, and listeners no doubt can get a link to the New South Wales Votes website on the Australian Christian Lobby website, acl.org.au. Dan Flynn, thanks so much for your update today on 2020.
That's my pleasure. Thank you, Neil. God bless. Appreciate that. Bye.